Story 1. The snail-carrying gardeners of Tenochtitlan had African cousins. You begin in the morning mist. Not the hot, dry wind of the Sahara, but the cool dampness of a shallow marsh, somewhere in what is now Mali. There is little sound, save the buzz of flies and the dull squelch of feet pressing into the fertile, submerged soil. You are standing on something that feels stable, a floating bed of woven reeds, earth, and composted plants. Beneath you, water. Around you, other platforms. Other men and women, quietly at work. The year is approximately 1300 CE, and you're in the midst of one of West Africa's least celebrated inventions, raised wetland farming. It's easy to think of floating farms as a Mesoamerican marvel, made famous by the chinampas of the Aztecs, those intricate grids of aquatic gardens built on the shallow lakes of Tenochtitlan. The imagery of men in canoes tending to plants on floating rafts is familiar in Latin American history books. But few know that across the Atlantic, West Africans were doing something remarkably similar. And depending on whom you ask, possibly even earlier, these were not haphazard gardens. They were systems, resilient, precise, quiet revolutions in the way humans adapted to the land. In floodplains, along the Niger River, especially near the inner delta, entire agricultural systems were created not by removing water, but by working with it. It wasn't flashier than terrace farming in Asia, or as monumentally romantic as Roman aqueducts. But it worked, and that, in the end, is what made it boring and effective. You watch as a woman bends down to scoop silt from the side of the canal and tosses it atop the raised bed. She's not just maintaining the soil, she's feeding it, enriching it. The constant layering of nutrients is what made this system sustainable. Crops like rice, yams, and vegetables grew in the floating soil, watered from below, anchored by bamboo-like stalks or thick reeds that reached into the riverbed. The raft farms didn't float freely, but were tethered to the shore or staked into place using carefully cut wood. Why do so few people know this? Part of the answer lies in how history has been recorded, and by whom. When colonial narratives were written, stories of African ingenuity often took a back seat. What wasn't monumental or written in Latin script was deemed primitive or unremarkable. A rice field built on floating earth in Mali didn't fit the image of Africa, painted by 19th century European explorers, that of tribes without infrastructure, nations without systems. But what you're looking at or listening to is infrastructure, a quiet, effective infrastructure built not for empire or ego, but for survival. Now, back to the snails. Snails, believe it or not, played a role in these systems. In certain parts of West Africa, they were carried in small woven pouches, or even in pockets, and released into the flooded fields. They served as both fertilizer processors and a protein source. Like organic janitors, they consumed decomposing matter and helped balance the microbial ecosystem. When grown large enough, they were harvested, providing an important dietary supplement. In this way, farmers not only grew crops, but cultivated miniature ecosystems. Does this sound familiar? In Mesoamerica, archaeologists have uncovered signs that Aztec farmers sometimes introduced snails and other small aquatic animals into their chinampas for the same reason. The idea of a micro-farm, complete with nutrient recyclers and edible species, was not unique to one civilization. It was an echo, possibly independent invention, possibly shared through slow cultural diffusion, or perhaps just the universal logic of working with water. But why snails? Because they were small, portable, and manageable. They reproduced easily, They didn't require herding, and most importantly, they stayed where you put them. Carrying snails in your pocket was not a superstition, it was a technology, a living tool, one you could carry with you from plot to plot. The more you examine this system, the more deliberate it becomes. From the planting cycles aligned with seasonal floods, to the composting of husks and fish bones into soil, it was a form of agriculture that needed no written instructions, only repetition, passed from hand to hand, from mother to daughter, from neighbor to apprentice. Yet almost no textbooks mention it. Instead, history highlights the towering mud mosques of Timbuktu or the camel, trains across the Sahel, but food systems are civilizations. You don't build empires without calories. And the calories in this region, they came from water, from marshland, from patience, from boring, repetitive, gentle tasks. Tasks you could fall asleep to. Were you listening closely enough? As the sun rises over the shimmering waterbeds, you see more farmers arrive. They don't rush, they don't shout. They step gently onto their floating gardens and begin the day's labor. Each step matters. Each turn of soil has been done 1,000 times. No one writes books about these people, but they fed nations, and yet the real question remains unanswered. Did these African wetland farms influence the Chinampas of Mesoamerica, or were they just whispers of the same ancient human instinct, an ocean apart? You awaken again to the sound of slow paddling, not in West Africa this time, but on a calm lake cradled by distant volcanoes. The water reflects the early light of dawn, broken only by the long silhouette of a canoe you're drifting through. Lake Texcoco, sometime around 1400 CE Tenochtitlan, has not yet reached its imperial peak, but it is already a city of floating green. A network of chinampas stretches across the water like patchwork quilts stitched into the lake itself. A man in a feathered cloak gestures to the soil under his feet. He is proud, though soft-spoken. He tells you, without speaking, that this isn't just mud, it's a formula. Layers of sediment dredged from canals, composted vegetation, and deous animal waste, arranged atop reed mats and wooden foundations that anchor the bed to the lake bottom. He points to a bundle tucked into the side of the raft, a woven container holding small, slimy creatures, snails. Here again, the humble mollusk appears, not merely as food, but as participant. What fascinates you now is not the presence of chinampas. You've read about them before, but the similarities to what you saw in West Africa. The same logic, applied half a world apart. Rich organic layering, use of tethered rafts, soil management by animals. A rhythm of maintenance tied to the water cycle. But is this coincidence? Archaeologists have long debated the possibility of pre-Columbian contact between Africa and the Americas. Mainstream history, cautious and peer-reviewed, says no. There's no definitive evidence of transatlantic trade or migration before Columbus. But some scholars, like Ivan van Sertima in the 20th century, argued otherwise. They pointed to sculptures with African features in Mesoamerican ruins, to ancient currents that could carry boats westward from the Gulf of Guinea, to myths and motifs that echoed across oceans. These theories are often dismissed by academia, and perhaps rightly so, given the lack of hard evidence. But you're not here to prove or disprove diffusion. You're here to notice the strange patterns that recur, like parallel brushstrokes on opposite ends of a canvas. Back in West Africa, farmers used long-handled rakes to stir water through the roots of their crops. In Mesoamerica, farmers did the same. In both places, families passed on the knowledge orally, tied to the rhythms of sun and season. No great marble inscriptions, no royal decrees, just calloused hands and silent knowledge. Even the scale is comparable. The Chinampas, around Tenochtitlan, could support an enormous population. Some estimates place the city's population above 200,000 before Spanish arrival. That level of urban density required more than maize fields on dry land. It required innovation. Quiet, slow, wet innovation. And in the Niger Delta, the inner river system once supported vast urban complexes like Gengino, a city dating back over 1,000 years, thriving with trade, ceramics, and agriculture, all without monumental architecture, just earth, water, and wisdom. There's another link, a linguistic one. The word Chinapero, meaning someone who works at Chinampa, has its roots in Nahuatl. But in certain West African languages, words for wetland fields also reference floating soil or fields of water. Could this be linguistic drift? Perhaps. Or perhaps the human brain, when faced with similar challenges, invents similar words. Now imagine the people, the ordinary ones. The woman in Mali whose mother taught her which reeds bend without breaking. The man in Tenochtitlan who knew which layer of muck produced the best growth. These are not emperors or generals, they're survivalists. They didn't write books, but they edited the soil. They didn't carve history into stone, but into rice stalks and maize husks. If civilization is measured by the ability to adapt, they were kings. The idea of convergence, when two cultures invent the same solution without contact, is humbling. It reminds you that human intelligence is not isolated, that necessity really is the mother of invention, and that perhaps the quietest minds solve the loudest problems. But then you remember something strange. In 1493, during his second voyage, Columbus brought sugarcane to the Caribbean, a crop native to South Asia. Within decades, African slaves were cultivating it in the Americas, using techniques they brought from the continent: ridge planting, compost, layering, irrigation ditches. These methods spread through the colonies like wildfire, and some historians now believe that African agricultural knowledge reshaped American soil more than any Spanish farming manual. Could this be the missing link? Not ancient contact, but knowledge transfer through force. Africans, stripped from their homes, carried not just pain, but techniques. Perhaps the similarities between wetland farming in Mali and Chinampa agriculture were further entwined. After contact, not because of shared roots, but because the roots were replanted. The timeline is fuzzy, the evidence fragmented, but it raises a deeper question. How much of what we call New World agriculture was simply African knowledge, renamed? And what if that knowledge had roots even older than we realize, stretching from ancient rivers to sunken marshes, from pocket snail to floating plots? Your canoe drifts silently between two plots. The man beside you picks up a clump of soil and lets it fall through his fingers. You recognize it now. It's not just dirt, it's memory. You are standing in silence now, not in a floating garden, but beside one that has dried and cracked. The raft, once buoyant and green, is nothing more than a collapsed frame of dead reeds and brittle roots. Time has passed, the water has receded, the gardeners have left. This is not a metaphor. This is what actually happened in both West Africa and Mesoamerica. The floating farms that once sustained civilizations began to disappear, not with a bang, but with quiet erosion. Empires fell, borders shifted, water levels changed, and with them, the farms. A technique passed down over centuries slowly stopped being passed down at all. In Mali, the rise of colonial plantations, changing hydrology, and imposed Western agricultural models chipped away at traditional systems. The French administration, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, viewed such indigenous practices as inefficient or unsound. They introduced their own schemes, canals, rice polders, mechanized tools, and dismissed the careful, community-managed floating gardens as primitive in the process. Not only did the farms disappear, so did the language, the rituals, and the slow, precise decisions that made them thrive. In post-colonial years, development agencies rarely bothered to ask elders how they had once farmed the floodplains. Few realized that a method designed to survive in flood cycles could teach something about resilience in an age of climate disruption. The Chinampas of Tenochtitlan suffered a parallel fate. After the Spanish conquest in the 1500s, the city of Tenochtitlan was razed and rebuilt as Mexico City. The lakes were drained. The Chinampa system was partly preserved around Xochimilco, but mostly relegated to the past, seen more as a cultural artifact than a living system. As concrete replaced canals and traffic replaced canoes, the quiet industry of the China pharaohs was drowned out by the 20th century. Both farming systems were remembered more for their quaintness than their genius. You walk along a tourist path now, somewhere near Xochimilco. The signs say floating gardens, but most visitors ride boats for the mariachi music and colored decorations. The Chinampas still exist, but not at the scale they once did. A few dedicated farmers still practice the old ways, but they are outnumbered by novelty and nostalgia in West Africa. The wetlands, too, have become battlegrounds between tradition and industrial farming. Satellite images show rice fields organized into rigid grids. The organic contours of old raft farms, if they survive at all, blend into the floodplain. Like ghosts, you wonder, how many techniques have we paved over simply because they were too slow, too gentle, or too boring to preserve? There's a deeper lesson in this. Not about ancient technology, but about the kinds of knowledge we choose to value. Modern science often rushes toward scale, faster irrigation, higher yield, mechanized precision. But the farmers with snails in their pockets weren't building for speed, they were building for endurance. Their methods worked with nature, not against it. They observed patiently, adjusted slowly, and responded to cycles that couldn't be accelerated. Perhaps that's why we forgot them, because they didn't produce drama. There was no golden statue, no towering stone wall, no explosive conquest. Just food, every day, for generations. Just resilience, unnoticed and uncelebrated. But the story doesn't end with disappearance. In recent years, scholars, ecologists, and local communities have begun re-examining these systems, not as quaint traditions, but as sophisticated models for sustainable agriculture. In Mali, researchers have started to trace the hydrological memory of ancient floodplains, finding patterns that could restore lost productivity. In Mexico, environmentalists have argued that reviving chinampas could help feed urban populations, while filtering polluted water and sequestering carbon. Some China pharaohs descendants of the old line are teaching again, and a few elders in the Sahel, now in their 70s and 80s, still remember how their parents taught them to build floating plots using nothing but stalks, soil, and time. You can almost hear them. You wait for the water. You listen to the reeds. You carry the snails. If you're quiet enough, The lessons are still there, embedded in rhythm, not rhetoric. The tragedy is not that these systems were forgotten. The tragedy is that they were never properly remembered to begin with. They were never inscribed in textbooks or marble plaques. They were dismissed as domestic work, women's work, peasant work, and yet they held empires up by their roots. You take one last look at the faded raft before you. In the soft mud nearby, you spot the faint trail of a snail, gliding slowly toward the reeds. You almost smile. Even now, the system is trying to reassemble itself, and so you wonder if we stopped searching for genius in grandeur, and instead looked for it in the patience of hands and the whisper of water. How much wisdom might still be waiting beneath our feet. Story 2. Africa didn't need Europe to build stone cities. You are walking alone through a valley of stone. No signs, no tour guides, just wind. Scattered across the rolling hills are walls, not the kind hastily thrown together, but thick, curved, granite walls, perfectly balanced without mortar. The stones are stacked so tightly that you can't slip a blade between them. Some walls twist like spirals, others encircle open courtyards. There are towers, tall, conical ones, rising, like beacons from the earth itself. The place feels deliberate, heavy with purpose, and yet it's almost completely silent in history books. You are in the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, a medieval city in southeastern Africa, once the heart of a powerful empire. From around the 11th to the 15th century, it thrived with trade, culture, and stonework so precise that 19th century Europeans refused to believe Africans built it. The disbelief wasn't casual. It was printed, institutionalized, and taught. Early European explorers and colonial scholars looked at these massive stone structures covering more than 700 hectares and concluded this couldn't be African work. Some claimed it was, built by Arabs. Others guessed Phoenicians. Some even suggested ancient Greeks. Anyone but the local Shona people, whose ancestors had lived there for centuries and still held oral histories of the builders. It wasn't until the 20th century, after decades of archaeological evidence, that the myth finally began to break. But the stain remains. Even today, many people in the West know more about the myth of foreign builders than the truth of African architects. So let's step back. Let's slow it down. Let's look at what actually happened. Not the myth, but the method. The people of Great Zimbabwe were not nomads or hunters living in huts. They were urban planners, traders, and stonemasons. They built one of the largest pre-colonial cities in sub-Saharan Africa. At its peak, it housed an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 people, a population comparable to many European towns at the time. The Great Enclosure, the most iconic part of the site, is a marvel. The outer wall stretches over 800 feet in circumference and stands up to 36 feet tall in places. All of it built without cement, without rebar, just stone on stone, carefully selected and laid down by skilled hands. But here's the boring part, and therefore the most impressive. They didn't build it all at once. Unlike the flash of empire building we associate with pharaohs and kings, Great Zimbabwe evolved slowly. The earliest structures began around the 11th century, and over the next 300 years, the city expanded, piece by piece. Generations worked on it. Stones were recycled, rearranged, refined. This wasn't a monument to ego, it was a city built through patience and continuity. You reach out and touch one of the walls. The granite feels cool, worn smooth by centuries of weather, not war. There's no paint, no gold leaf, no inscriptions, just function. That might be why historians ignored it, but archaeology tells a richer story. Excavations in and around the site have revealed signs of long-distance trade. Chinese porcelain, Arabian glass beads, and Indian textiles. Great Zimbabwe wasn't isolated. It was a node in a global trade network that stretched from Africa's interior to the Swahili coast, and beyond to the Indian Ocean world. And what fueled this city? Cattle, gold, and above all, stone. The granite used for construction was locally quarried, shaped with iron tools, and stacked with an understanding of balance and gravity that modern engineers still admire. Dry stone masonry is not an accident. It requires precision. One misplaced stone can bring down a wall, and these walls have stood for over 700 years. You follow the curving pathways between structures. They are narrow, intentionally so, designed to funnel people towards central spaces. The city was divided into zones: elite housing, communal areas, and outlying suburbs. There were smaller satellite settlements all across the region, over 300 identified so far, each with its own stone ruins, echoing the style of the main site. This wasn't a fluke. It was a civilization. But because it wasn't loud, because it didn't build pyramids or wage massive wars, it was forgotten, or worse, erased. European colonizers had a motive to deny African achievement. If Africans had built stone cities, cultivated trade networks, and governed urban centers, it challenged the entire justification for colonization. The idea that Africa needed Europe to civilize it depended on a blank slate narrative. Great Zimbabwe was a glaring contradiction, so the history was buried, sometimes literally. Early excavations were poorly documented or outright falsified. In 1905, archaeologist David Randall McKeever, after a careful study, concluded that Great Zimbabwe was indeed of African origin. His work was attacked. It took decades before his findings were accepted, and even then, grudgingly. Meanwhile, the myths continued. Even as late as the 1970s, Rhodesian schoolbooks still claimed the site was built by foreign hands. The name of the country itself, Rhodesia, was imposed in honor of Cecil Rhodes, a man who saw Africa as a land to be taken, not understood. But here, in the stone silence, the truth remains. You sit for a moment on one of the fallen walls. No plaques, no tour buses, just the quiet hum of wind through grass, and the slow realization that the people who built this city knew exactly what they were doing. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't borrowed. It was African. Entirely African. And now the question you can't quite shake. If one great African city could be denied for centuries, how many others were buried not by time, but by disbelief? You return to the site, this time with new eyes. Not as a visitor, but as a witness to a slow, quiet symphony of labor. You see them, the builders. Not nameless shadows, but people with skills, routines, and calloused hands. A group of stonemasons gathers in the early light, sorting granite, slabs into sizes, brushing dust from their edges, humming softly. There is no rush. Stonework is a rhythm, not a race. One of them picks up a perfectly shaped block. He doesn't measure it with a ruler. He taps it lightly against another stone, listening for the right sound. It's the dull note of harmony he's waiting for. A resonance. The stones have to sing in agreement before they're laid. This is the kind of history that rarely gets told. We speak of empires and monuments, but not of men waking before dawn to chip granite with iron chisels they forged themselves. not of women tending to the goats and gathering firewood, while the walls slowly rose behind them, not of the teachers, the potters, the herders, the weavers, all the people who make a city without being carved into its walls, because great Zimbabwe was not a fortress. It wasn't designed for defense. The walls have no battlements, no arrow slits, no towers for archers. They weren't built to repel armies. They were built to define space, to organize the sacred and the secular, the public and the private. It was social architecture. The great enclosure, with its sweeping curves and inner towers, may have served ceremonial or symbolic purposes. Some believe it was the royal compound. Others suggest it had astronomical significance, aligning with solstices or lunar events. But no one knows for sure. What's clear is that the walls were meant to shape how people moved, how they gathered, how they saw themselves, and how they were seen. From a distance, the stone towers would have been visible above the treetops, a signal to travelers, traders, and neighboring peoples that this was a city of substance. And indeed, people came from all directions. Excavations have uncovered trade goods from across the Indian Ocean world, glass beads from India, porcelain from China, coins and textiles likely from Persia or the Arabian Peninsula. These weren't scattered trinkets. They were indicators of sustained contact, consistent routes, and complex exchanges. The engine behind this commerce: gold. Southern Africa is rich in gold deposits, and Great Zimbabwe controlled access to some of the most lucrative ones. Gold dust was gathered from rivers and panned from the soil. It was transported in tightly woven pouches, traded for salt, fabrics, ceramics, and status. And yet there's something quietly impressive in how little gold was left behind at the site itself. Unlike the tombs of Egypt or the temples of Mesoamerica, Great Zimbabwe doesn't shimmer with buried treasure. The wealth here was fluid, not hoarded. It moved through hands and caravans, not into pyramids. The builders of Zimbabwe weren't obsessed with eternal glory. They were interested in structure, community, and trade, and dignity, in the oral traditions passed down through Shona elders. The builders of Great Zimbabwe are remembered not just for what they made, but for how they lived, with respect for land, harmony with seasons, and reverence for ancestry. Many of the stones were recycled. When a structure was no longer needed, its materials were carefully moved to another site. There was no need to quarry new blocks if the old ones could be repurposed. This wasn't wasteful, it was wise, and it speaks to a culture that valued continuity over conquest. You find yourself inside one of the smaller enclosures now. The air is still. A bird hops along the edge of the wall. There's no grand inscription, no statue of a ruler, just a feeling that people lived here, real people, with ordinary joys and ordinary griefs. You remember that when the British archaeologist Gertrude Catton Thompson conducted her study in the 1920s, the first one to publicly and definitively assert African authorship, she was mocked by her peers. Her work was thorough, but it challenged colonial pride. It said plainly, these ruins are the product of a native culture. They are African. Even that simple sentence was revolutionary at the time, and yet the people who built these cities never needed anyone's permission to be great. They didn't write manifestos. They didn't conquer neighbors to prove legitimacy. They built with stone. They farmed with the rhythm of the land. They raised children behind walls that curled like protective arms. And they vanished, not because they were conquered, but because the world around them shifted. Around the 15th century, trade routes changed, climate patterns altered rainfall, Political power moved north and east. The population of Great Zimbabwe slowly declined, and new centers emerged: Kami, Mutapa, and others. The stones were left behind, not in ruin, but in quiet dignity. But you're left with a final thought. Why do we only value cities that collapse in flame? Why do we remember ruins born from violence, and forget those left behind by choice? You're walking along the edge of a dry riverbed now, where once the flow of gold, cattle, and conversation passed through the hills like veins through a body. The city of Great Zimbabwe is behind you, or perhaps still all around you, in the stones, in the soil, and in the stories. This section is not about the city's rise or even its slow decline. It's about what came afterward: the silence, the erasure, and the quiet return of truth. For centuries, Great Zimbabwe lay forgotten by history books, not because it wasn't known, but because it was inconvenient. Colonial governments in southern Africa found the site troubling. If Africans had built stone cities, not one but many, then the logic of colonization began to fall apart. The idea that Africa was empty, that it lacked civilization, law, or structure, became harder to defend. So the stones were ignored. Or worse, misattributed in Rhodesia. Schoolchildren were taught that Arab traders or lost white races had built the ruins. The local population, the descendants of the Shona builders, were told that their ancestors were incapable of such architecture. Imagine being raised beside stone towers your ancestors stacked, only to be told they were never yours. That kind of forgetting is not passive, it's deliberate, and yet the truth remained. Beneath layers of myth and denial, archaeologists kept digging. Local elders kept remembering. Even as politics tried to erase the past, the stones continued to speak through stratigraphy, artifacts, alignments, and oral tradition. When Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, the country reclaimed its name from the ruins. It wasn't just symbolism. It was a quiet revolution in memory. Imagine that, naming a nation after a ruined city, not because it fell in war, but because it stood long enough to be remembered, because it proved something deeper, that greatness doesn't require conquest, only endurance. And today, slowly, the story is returning, in school books, in museums, in the voices of guides who now walk visitors through the great enclosure, explaining how their great-grandmothers told them the stones were sacred. Scholars from across Africa and the diaspora have come to study not just the site, but the worldview it represented. A worldview that doesn't seek immortality in marble, but meaning in balance. There are still mysteries. The exact purpose of the conical tower in the great enclosure is unknown. Was it symbolic, ceremonial, a granary, a solar marker? The truth may never be recovered in full, but perhaps that's the point. Not everything worth remembering fits into a neat timeline or textbook. Some stories remain half buried, half whispered, preserved not in ink but in patience. You walk once more among the stones. A small boy and his grandmother are sitting nearby, breaking open a fruit with practiced hands. The boy asks her who built the walls. She smiles and answers softly, "Our people." She doesn't elaborate. She doesn't need to. The confidence in her voice is enough. This place, once denied to its own descendants, is theirs again. Not because of a textbook or a tourist plaque, but because the memory was never truly lost, only silenced. And now you know too. You've walked the curved corridors. You've touched the granite. You've felt the weight of stone, not just as architecture, but as testimony. You've seen that Africa's history doesn't need outside authors to matter. It was always here, solid, rooted, waiting. And as you look back at the last remaining tower, you consider what other histories still lie waiting in stone, dismissed not because they were small, but because they were African. Story 3. The kingdom where women ruled armies. Dahomey wasn't a myth. The forest is quiet, except for the sound of bare feet moving swiftly over leaves. There are no drums, no horns, only breath, low and steady, and the soft clatter of iron against thighs as warriors adjust their belts. You are deep in 18th century West Africa, standing just outside the royal capital of Abumi, in the kingdom of Dahomey. Before you is a regiment of soldiers preparing for war, but this isn't what you expect. These soldiers are women, not camp followers, not caretakers, warriors. Each one is dressed in a tunic of red or blue, barefoot by tradition, armed with a short musket or curved machete. Some carry small iron throwing knives tucked into their waists. Their faces are hard, unreadable, not from fear but from familiarity. They've done this before, many times. This isn't a special unit. This is an elite cause, a permanent state-supported force. They are called by many names. In the West, they've been nicknamed the Dahomey Amazons, a reference imposed by 19th century European observers who couldn't imagine female soldiers outside the realm of myth. But within the kingdom, they were known more truthfully as the Mino, meaning our mothers in the Fon language, and they were not a fantasy. For nearly 200 years, the Mino fought, trained, commanded, and sometimes even died in service to the Dahomean king. At their height, they numbered in the thousands. They guarded the palace. They led charges. They negotiated treaties. And they executed punishments. To many of their enemies, they were feared more than the men. But how did such a force come to exist? The origins are hazy, as many things are in pre-colonial history, but the rise of the Mino is usually traced back to the early 1700s, under King Haugadia, or his son, King Agaja. Initially, they may have served as elephant hunters, women, who displayed skill and stamina equal to any male warrior. Over time, their role expanded. By the reign of King Gezo in the 19th century, they had become an official arm of the military, trained, fed, and respected by the royal court. And it wasn't symbolic. It was logistical. Dahomey was a small but ambitious kingdom, located in what is now southern Benin. It lacked the vast manpower of larger empires. To expand and survive, it required every ounce of strength its people could offer. The Mino weren't recruited because of some modern idea of gender equity. They were recruited because they were effective. But make no mistake, their position was exceptional. Most pre-colonial African armies were male-dominated. Female warriors did exist in various forms: bodyguards, archers, commanders of domestic defense, but rarely in such numbers, and never as central to state warfare. Dahomey stands apart, and what made the Mino even more extraordinary was not just that they fought, but how they trained. Discipline was intense. Recruits were selected, young sometimes as girls, sometimes as adult women, and underwent years of martial instruction. They lived in royal barracks, separated from the rest of society. They were considered married to the king in a symbolic, celibate sense, though they had no sexual relationship with him. This elevated their status and prevented them from marrying or having children, allowing them to dedicate themselves fully to service. They trained with spears, blades, and flintlock muskets. They practiced climbing thorny acacia trees, barefoot, sprinting across hot sand, and breaking through mock enemy lines. Ceremonial rituals tested their loyalty and dulled fear. Some were made to kill captives as a rite of passage. Brutal. Yes, but so were the times. European traders and missionaries who encountered them were stunned. British explorer Richard Burton, in the 1860s, wrote that the Mino flinched from no danger and shrank from no suffering. French soldiers, in the later 19th century, would eventually face them in combat, and many would not forget the encounter, nor survive it. Yet here's the curious thing. For all their legend, the Mino are often reduced to a footnote in African history, or worse, transformed into fictionalized tropes. Modern media, most recently in films, has revived interest in the Dahomey Amazons, but the stories are often dramatized, stripped of nuance, or focused on romance and rebellion. The reality is quieter, slower, more complex. These were not feminist icons in the modern sense. They were instruments of a monarchy. Some were enforcers of brutality. Others were village girls who had no say in their recruitment. They could be loyal, fierce, and terrifying, but also deeply human. They cried, they bled, they aged one record. From a European doctor noted that the Mino had specialized healers in their ranks, older women who carried bundles of herbs, treated arrow wounds, and used palm oil to seal cuts. Another described how, after battle, some of the soldiers sat in silence, sharpening their blades, not from pride, but out of ritual. The act was part memory, part therapy, part denial, and yet their presence changes how we think about Africa's past. It breaks the myth of passivity, the myth that African women were always hidden behind huts, tending to children, while men decided the future. Here, in the kingdom of Dahomey, the future marched barefoot, carrying a rifle. And so you wonder, what does it mean when the most feared warriors in a kingdom are women, and why do we almost never learn their names? You're standing now at the gates of the royal palace in Abomey, not a palace of marble or gold, but of red earth, thick walls, and sacred courtyards. It smells of dust and history. This was the center of Dahomey's power, the hub of a state where every whisper and footstep mattered. And inside these walls lived the Mino. They were not guests, they were guardians. Their quarters were located within the palace compound, a self-contained world with its own rules. By day they trained, by night they patrolled. Their daily lives followed the rhythm of ceremony and discipline, measured by rituals of obedience and sharpened steel. Each warrior had a rank, a title, a duty. New recruits served under veterans, learning not only how to fight, but how to walk, speak, and present themselves before the king. There were commanders, quartermasters, and aides-de-camp. Leadership within the Mino was strictly hierarchical, and promotion was based on merit, not marriage, not family, not chance. And yes, they carried weapons everywhere. The short, curved swords modeled after local agricultural tools were ideal for close combat. They wore them strapped diagonally across the back or slung low across the hip. Others carried muskets imported from Europe, modified and maintained by the kingdom's own armorers. Ammunition was stored in pouches made from leather or animal skin. Some wore iron anklets that rattled softly, not to signal their approach, but to announce that fear walked with them. But their deadliest weapon was not steel, it was belief. The Mino were taught to regard death not as something to be avoided, but as a form of service. They swore lifelong loyalty to the king and kingdom. Many rituals involved blood, not just of others, but their own. During certain festivals, they made shallow cuts along their forearms, letting drops fall into ceremonial basins. It was a kind of pact, a declaration: I do not belong to myself anymore. Still, not all was uniform or unquestioning. Within the ranks, friendships were common. Older Mino mentored the younger. Some sang as they worked, humming rhythmic songs as they sharpened blades or polished muskets. Oral traditions say some even composed poetic battle chants, not for glory, but for focus. There were songs about home, about discipline, about rain. There were rivalries too, power struggles, moments of hesitation in battle. Not every woman was fearless. Some cracked under pressure. Others carried scars, emotional and physical, from missions that blurred the line between valor and violence. And then there was the king. Dahome's monarchy was absolute. The ruler, often called a Hosu, wielded authority over all domains: military, spiritual, judicial. The Mino were his personal army, his bodyguards, his executioners. When he walked in public, they flanked him like shadows. When he made war, they led the charge. But they were more than protection. They were also spectacle. During royal ceremonies, the Mino performed martial dances, synchronized movements involving spears, rifles, and coordinated stomps that shook the courtyard dust. Spectators held their breath, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was real. The warriors you were watching would soon be on the battlefield. The palace was both temple and training ground at the height of their power. Under King Gezo, in the mid-1800s, the Mino were central to the kingdom's expansion. Gezo reorganized the army, professionalized its ranks, and increased the number of women soldiers. Foreign envoys recorded shock at their discipline. One French officer noted, "They marched in silence, like wind through dry grass, eyes ahead, mouths closed. The men followed behind, but war had consequences." The Mino fought in dozens of campaigns, especially against rival kingdoms like Oyo and the city-states along the coast. These wars were not always defensive. Some were brutal expansions of Dahome's influence. Others were aimed at controlling trade, especially the human trade. And here lies one of the more difficult truths. Dahomey participated in the transatlantic slave trade. The Mino, as the king's elite soldiers, were sometimes involved in these campaigns. Captives were taken, villagers were raised, slaves were sold to European merchants in exchange for weapons, textiles, and rum. The warriors we now admire also served a system that inflicted generational trauma on others. This doesn't erase their legacy, but it complicates it. The Mino were not symbols. They were people full of contradictions, courageous and violent, disciplined and ruthless, revered and feared. It's tempting to romanticize them, to see them as an ancient version of modern ideals. But to truly understand their place in history, you must see the full picture, not just the red sashes and sharp blades, but the grief, the orders, the choices, and the silences. And then you ask yourself, what does it mean to be remembered? For your strength, but not for your sorrow. The dust is thick now. You're walking the battlefield near Katana. In the year 1892, the French have come, not as guests or traders, but as invaders. And the Mino, reduced in numbers, but not in resolve, are still fighting. They wear no armor. They crouch behind trees, fire from thick undergrowth, then vanish into smoke. Some carry rifles, others only blades. They know the land. They know the patterns of French patrols. They have been watching. But the enemy is different now. This is no longer a contest of empires clashing on even ground. The Dahomey kingdom, weakened by years of trade pressure, internal division, and foreign meddling, is fighting a modern war with outdated tools. The Mino, still fierce and disciplined, are facing artillery, repeating rifles, STEAMSHIPS. The world is changing and fast. French troops, armed with the latest weapons of the industrial age, begin carving through the countryside. The king at the time, Bahanzin, refuses to surrender. He deploys his forces, men and women alike, in a desperate defense of the kingdom's sovereignty. The Mino, many of whom are now aging veterans, rise to the call. They do not beg for mercy. They do not retreat. In one skirmish, recorded by a French officer, a Minot soldier is shot in the leg, but drags herself forward, using her arms to stab a French soldier in the gut. She dies with her blade buried. Another is captured, questioned, and spits in her captor's face. She is executed. She does not flinch, but even steel breaks against the march of empire. The war lasts months. By the end of 1892, the capital is taken. The royal palace is burned. The king is exiled. The Mino, what remains of them, are disbanded. Some are absorbed into French colonial militias. Others return to their villages, forbidden to speak of their past. A few simply vanish, and with them a silence falls, not just on the battlefield, but on the historical record. The French, writing their reports, describe the Mino with a mix of awe and discomfort. They call them unnatural, ferocious, masculine. The idea of women as warriors, skilled, fearless, unyielding, does not sit well in the colonial imagination. They are rewritten as myth, reduced to novelties. For decades, their story remains dim, a whisper in the corners of oral history, a line or two in military journals, a curiosity in colonial archives. Schoolchildren in the West grow up learning about Joan of Arc, Boudica, and Cleopatra, but rarely, if ever, hear of women like Naniska, Souk, or Aya Bar. And yet the memory survives in the songs of old women in Benin, in the dances performed during annual festivals in Abumi, in the family stories passed down quietly. Your great-great-aunt, she was one of them. The king's soldiers, the ones with the iron bracelets, and slowly the story returns. In the 20th and 21st centuries, scholars begin to piece together. The history, oral tradition is cross-referenced with colonial records. Elders are interviewed. Artifacts are re-examined. And suddenly, a truth long buried re-emerges. The most feared warriors in one of West Africa's most powerful kingdoms were women. No longer a myth, no longer a novelty. Today, statues of Mino warriors stand outside museums in Benin. Some wear headscarves and carry rifles. Others raise machetes skyward. Visitors pause before them, not just to marvel at their courage, but to feel something older, deeper: pride, grief, recognition, because the story of the Minnow is not just about women in war. It's about how power is remembered, how strength is narrated, how entire lives can be erased when they don't fit the template. But the stones still remember. The earth still remembers. And so do you. You followed them from the silent footfalls of forest patrols to the fiery collapse of a capital. You've heard the rattle of iron bracelets and the whispers of names almost lost. And now, as you stand before the last cracked wall of the royal palace, you ask, if these women could command armies, why were they left out of history's own ranks? Story 4. When Afrikaans were the first to map the stars, lying on your back in the dry grass of the Sahel somewhere, near present-day Mali or Niger. There's no electricity here, no glare of cities, only stars, thousands of them, scattered like glowing seeds across the velvet sky. And you're not just stargazing, you're studying. Around you, others do the same. Elders point upward, murmuring, names in a language shaped by wind and time. Children follow their fingers. The sky is not just decoration, it's a calendar, a compass, a memory. Each star has a story, each pattern a purpose. This is Africa. And the night sky is a library. Before the age of telescopes, space programs, or star charts etched on paper, people across the continent were already mapping the heavens, not in the Western sense of declination and degrees, but in a deeply practical, observational, and narrative way. Here in the ancient region once ruled by the Dogon people, knowledge of the stars goes back centuries, maybe longer. The Dogon are famous today for their complex astronomical beliefs, especially about Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky. But this story isn't just about one ethnic group or one star. It's about a much larger truth, one often left out of science textbooks. Africans were studying the stars long before modern astronomy gave them credit. Let's begin with what we know. The Dogon people live in the Bandia Gara escarpment in Mali, a vast sandstone plateau with cliffs, caves, and villages that seem to grow out of the rock. Their cultural practices are old, their oral traditions even older. And among those traditions is a sophisticated understanding of celestial bodies. Most famously, the Dogon are known for their knowledge of Sirius B, a white dwarf star that orbits the main Sirius star and is invisible to the naked eye. According to the Dogon, this star, which they call Potolo, is incredibly dense, small, and important. They describe its orbit around the larger Sirius star and attribute to it cosmic significance in their creation stories. This stunned Western anthropologists in the 20th century, French scholars Marcel Grial and Germaine Dietlin, after years of fieldwork with the Dogon in the 1930s and 1940s, published accounts claiming that the Dogon knew about the existence of Sirius B long before. Western astronomers confirmed it with telescopes in 1862. Their research ignited debates. How could this knowledge exist without scientific instruments? Some scholars proposed outside contact, maybe with ancient Egyptians, Phoenicians, or even aliens. Others accused the researchers of misinterpreting Dogon cosmology or projecting ideas onto the culture. But what if the truth is simpler and more impressive? What if ancient observers, through centuries of patient watching, noticed irregularities in the brightness or movement of Sirius? What if Dogon cosmology, rich with metaphor and symbolism, encoded real celestial knowledge into stories? After all, most cultures have done this. The difference is that in Europe, those stories were later formalized into physics. In Africa, they remained as sacred tradition. Now, shift your gaze. We're no longer in Mali. You are standing among the Nile River temples of ancient Nubia and Egypt, where the alignment of structures to the stars was a science unto itself. Temples like Karnak, Abu Simbel, and others were aligned with astonishing precision to celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, and the rising of Sirius, known to the Egyptians as solved it. The annual flooding of the Nile, which sustained all life in the region, was predicted by the heliacal rising of Sirius. Priests watched for it with intense focus. The calendar was built around it. Across the African continent, the stars served not only religious and cultural roles, but deeply practical ones. In southern Africa, the Kusan peoples used the position of the Pleiades cluster to signal the coming of seasons. When the stars vanished from the sky, it was time to plant. When they returned, it was time to harvest. In East Africa, the Borana people of Ethiopia developed a calendar entirely based on lunar phases and star positions, using 7 main constellations as their guiding framework. It's not abstract, it's accurate, and it didn't require any instruments beyond the human eye, disciplined memory, and intergenerational instruction. But why do so few people know this? Because the history of astronomy is often told through a European lens, beginning in ancient Greece, skipping forward to Galileo and Newton, and ignoring vast swaths of indigenous knowledge. The idea that Africans, often stereotyped as primitive or isolated, were serious observers of the cosmos, doesn't fit easily into that story. And yet, it's true. Africans were not just passive sky watchers, they were interpreters. They built calendars, set rituals, aligned buildings, and taught children how to read the heavens like scripture. And they did it all without fanfare. They didn't inscribe their observations in Latin. They didn't publish journals. They told stories. They embedded celestial facts in metaphor, in song, in the names of animals and gods. In that way, the knowledge survived, even when empires fell, even when books were burned, even when colonizers ignored it. And so, here you lie again, on your back beneath the stars, feeling small but not insignificant. Somewhere in this sky, Sirius is rising, and you can almost hear a voice, perhaps an elder's, whispering the story of Tolo, of the world egg that spun before creation, of the path of ancestors traced across the Milky Way. You wonder how many truths have we mistaken for myth, simply because they came dressed in story instead of math. You are standing at the edge of a wide grassy plain, far from city lights, far from noise. The sun is just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across a cluster of standing stones. They don't look like much at first, just rocks, quiet, weathered, and still. But then you notice the alignment. One by one, the shadows stretch toward specific points on the ground, touching small depressions in the earth. Some align with the sunrise, others with distant stars. None of it appears accidental. You are at Nabta Playa, in southern Egypt, a site older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids. Here, in the middle of the Nubian desert, prehistoric Africans raised a stone circle around 7,000 years ago, and they didn't do it for decoration, they did it to track the sky. Archaeologists believe the standing stones at Nabta Playa served as a calendar and astronomical observatory, marking the summer solstice and the rising of certain stars, particularly Sirius. This celestial event, as with ancient Egypt further north, signaled the coming of rains and the potential for life. But who were these people? They weren't pharaohs or kings. They were pastoralists, cattle herders living in what was then a semi-lush savanna, long before the Sahara became a true desert. They raised livestock, dug wells, and watched the heavens. For them, time wasn't measured in minutes, but in stars. Seasons mattered, more than seconds, and the sky was the most reliable clock they had. The stones are not massive like those of Giza. but they're deliberate. The placement is too precise, too patterned to be random. Some stones are arranged in linear alignments with solstice points. Others form radial patterns, pointing to rising stars. It's subtle, but it's science. The people who made this had no written language, no metal tools, but they observed, recorded, remembered, and passed it down through generations, through stories, through stone, and the pattern repeats across Africa in Senegal. Among the Sira people, star observation was deeply tied to agriculture and religious ritual. They tracked the stars for seasonal changes, burial ceremonies, and fertility rites. Their knowledge was mapped into oral poetry, long rhythmic verses passed down from elder to child. In Nigeria, the Igbo and Yoruba cosmologies placed deep emphasis on celestial bodies. The movement of the moon and the constellations informed both planting cycles and divination. The Yoruba calendar itself, still used for religious observance today, is lunar-based, echoing a tradition older than the Gregorian system. But perhaps one of the most overlooked examples is in Namibia. Among the San people, one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, the San tell stories of the Milky Way as the ashes of a fire flung across the sky. They name constellations not by Greek myths, but by the behavior of animals and spirits. A group of stars might represent a giraffe bending to drink. Another cluster, the footprints of a lion. These stories are not random. They are sky maps embedded. In memory, San elders have been known to use the stars, not only for navigation, but for storytelling that includes seasonal cues, when to hunt, when to move, when to wait. Their cosmology is a guidebook, poetic but precise. This is what makes African astronomy so different and so easy to ignore in formal textbooks, because it wasn't recorded in charts or diagrams. It was lived. It was in the way a child learned to recognize Orion's belt, not as Orion, but as a line of zebra footprints. It was in the way a farmer planted when the Pleiades disappeared, in how a widow knew when to begin a mourning ritual based on the angle of the moon, and most of all it was in the silence of stones. Back at Nabda Playa, the sun has risen fully now. The shadows are gone. The stones are still. The desert stretches wide. No one lives here anymore, but the alignment remains. The design is still visible to those who look. And yet, most people never hear of this place. They know about Stonehenge, about Greek astronomy, about the Mayans, but not this circle of ancient Africans watching Sirius through a dusty sky, carving cosmic rhythms into their world long before telescopes were even imagined. So you ask, if a culture maps the stars, but doesn't write it down, does it still count as science, or only as myth? Night falls again. You are sitting by a fire now, not in the past, but in the present. A small rural village in northern Kenya. The air smells of smoke and dust. The night is still, and above you, the stars are back. Only this. Time, no one is looking up. Children are inside, huddled around television screens powered by solar panels. The adults are talking softly, tending to the last cooking fires. The sky still hangs in its ancient beauty, but fewer people recognize it. The Pleiades rise, unnoticed. Sirius glows in its brilliance, unremarked. The old knowledge is fading, not because it was wrong, but because it was oral, and in a world that rewards written data and scientific credentials, stories do not compete well with spreadsheets. But the stars haven't changed. They are still in the same positions. still rise and fall with the seasons, still blink down across Africa with the same rhythms they always have. You could say they are the most consistent historical record we have, and African cultures, for millennia, read them like scripture. The tragedy is not that African astronomy was ignored, but that it was quietly disqualified from science. Why? Because it used narrative, not numbers. Because it was passed down through song, not peer review. Because it was female elders sitting around fire circles, not men in observatories with beards and brass instruments. But if science is simply the disciplined study of nature, then Africa was doing science long before anyone called it that. Now, let's return to the Dogon one last time. Their knowledge of Sirius B, that invisible companion star, has been heavily debated. Some modern researchers argue that what the French anthropologists recorded was misinterpreted or contaminated by prior exposure to Western knowledge. Maybe, maybe not. But the Dogon cosmology is deeper than just one star. They speak of celestial spirals, of multiple worlds, of cycles of life and rebirth tied to astronomical observations. Their stories may not follow the rules of modern physics, but they reflect a systematic, repeatable, observational understanding of the night sky, and that's what science is, even when whispered, not written. It's in the stones of Nabta Playa, in the agricultural rituals of the Sira, in the calendar systems of the Barana, in the quiet alignment of tombs, temples, and cattle enclosures across the continent. Africa's sky is full of knowledge, but knowledge without celebration fades. Today, African astrophysicists and cultural historians are trying to reconnect these threads, to place indigenous skywatching within the broader story of human science. Planetariums are being built in Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana. Cultural astronomy is being taught again, not as curiosity, but as legacy. Imagine a child in Dakar or Addis Ababa who learns about space, not from NASA alone, but from the stars. Their ancestors followed to plant millet, bury kings, or mark the new year. That is not nostalgia. That is reclamation, because the sky has no borders. It doesn't care who looks first. It only asks that we remember. And so you lie back once more. The embers glow. Above you, Sirius shines again, the same way it did 7,000 years ago, for the stone builders of Nabta Playa, for the priests of Egypt, for the stargazers of the Sahel. And you whisper to yourself, maybe just loud enough to be heard, if the stars never forgot us, why did we forget that we once understood them? Story 5. The forgotten libraries of Timbuktu are walking through a city built of sand, not dunes, but walls, smooth, sun-baked and brown, rising from the Saharan floor like a mirage. The wind hums through narrow alleys. Doors of carved wood swing gently on rusted hinges. The year is somewhere in the 1300s, and the city is Timbuktu. You've heard of Timbuktu before, in jokes, in legends, as a faraway nowhere, a place of ends or absences. All the way to Timbuktu, they say, meaning the most distant imaginable place. But Timbuktu was not the end of the world. It was once its intellectual center. You pause at the foot of a modest building, not grand, not gilded, a mud brick house with a small wooden sign. A library. You step inside, and the air shifts. Cooler, calmer, and darker. Inside are shelves made from date palm wood. On them, not books, but bundled manuscripts, wrapped in cloth, tied with string. Handwritten on fragile paper, leather, or gazelle skin. thousands of them. You are not in Europe. There are no printing presses. But here, in this quiet desert city, scholars are copying, preserving, and debating the great texts of the world. And it didn't begin with colonialism. It began long before. In the 13th century, Timbuktu rose to prominence as part of the Mali Empire, a powerful West African kingdom rich with gold, salt, and rarely emphasized knowledge. It became a major node on the trans-Saharan trade routes. Caravans of camels crossed the desert to trade not only goods but ideas. With them came books, scholars, and scribes. The Sankha University, one of 3 major learning centers in Timbuktu, became a hub for Islamic scholarship, rivaling institutions in Cairo and Fez. But unlike rigid universities with degrees and formal classes, learning in Timbuktu was personal, intimate, and deeply respectful of oral and written tradition. A single scholar might teach dozens of students beneath a tree. Lessons weren't standardized, they were copied by hand, rewritten again and again. Entire libraries were compiled this way, growing within families and mosques like trees from a shared root. The subjects, not just theology, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, law, medicine, grammar, history, ethics, commentary on Greek and Roman texts, observations on local rainfall patterns, debates about astronomy and medicine. A medieval manuscript from Timbuktu might contain marginal notes that reference Aristotle, alongside diagrams of the stars, all in elegant Arabic script. Some manuscripts included texts from North Africa, the Middle East, even Persia. Others were original African works, treatises written by Timbuktu's own scholars in styles unique to the region. Many were written in Ajami African languages like Songhai or Fulford, written using Arabic letters. And here is the truth buried in dust. Timbuktu was a city of readers, not just religious readers, scientific readers, curious readers. Families passed down books like heirlooms. A scholar's collection was not just a sign of status, it was a map of memory. It's estimated that at its height, Timbuktu held over 700,000 manuscripts, far more than most European libraries of the same era. And yet, how often is this mentioned? You've likely heard of the Renaissance, of Gutenberg, of Newton and Descartes. But Timbuktu rarely appears in those timelines. Why? Because it was African and Islamic, and dusty, because its libraries weren't bound in leather or shelved behind glass, because its texts were often handwritten, passed from teacher to student, annotated with personal thoughts in the margins, because the wisdom here didn't shout it. Whispered on whispering knowledge is easy to ignore still. The scholars here understood something powerful. Preservation is resistance. In a world where so much knowledge is fragile, vulnerable to fire, war, or forgetfulness, every copied line was a promise, a continuation, a quiet defiance of time. You turn a page now, carefully, slowly. The ink is faded, but still legible. The script curves in a graceful arc. It's a poem about justice. The date is 1427. Outside, the wind kicks sand against the door, and you wonder if a city writes the world's wisdom into silence. But no one tells the story. Does the wisdom still remain? You awaken with the dawn, call to prayer echoing across the rooftops of 15th century Timbuktu. Light slips through the cracks of a small window above your head. The scent of old paper, leather bindings, and ink-stained wood fills the air. You are in the home of a scribe, and already the house is stirring. Children fetch water from clay pots. Apprentices grind dried plant dyes into pigment. In the back room, two students argue over a translation of Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, comparing the original Arabic with marginal notes written in Songhai. The manuscript sits on a woven mat, its delicate parchment protected by soft cloth. This isn't a palace, it's a family home. But its walls house something greater than gold. A library, and this home isn't unique. Across Timbuktu, in homes, mosques, and madrasas, private libraries thrive. Some families guard a few dozen texts, others several thousand. The manuscripts are copied by hand, stored in wooden chests or stacked in corners, and they are read aloud, together, carefully. You see now that the act of copying is not just it's ceremonial. Every stroke of the reed pen is a form of prayer, a tether to tradition, a rewriting of memory. It may take months to reproduce a single book. The scribe must understand not only the words, but the rhythm, the spacing, the footnotes, even the margin scribbles passed on from generations before. And what do these manuscripts contain? Let's open a few. One discusses geometry using local examples, measuring land along the Niger River. Another is a philosophical debate on the ethics of wealth. If a merchant profits from scarcity, is he complicit in suffering? A third is a treatise on astronomy, complete with hand-drawn charts showing the position of Venus in the West African sky. Notes in the margin suggest a local star ritual tied to agricultural planting. And yes, many deal with Islamic law, theology, and Sufi thought. But even within those, you find unique African interpretations, legal rulings that consider lineage customs, pastoral life, rain ceremonies. These are not static texts imported from the Middle East. They are living documents, constantly revised and recontextualized by local minds. Some scholars wrote under pseudonyms, others signed with elaborate seals. Female scholars are less documented, but recent manuscript finds hint at their presence. Commentaries, letters, lineage notations, signed in a woman's hand. You realize now, this wasn't just a center of copying. It was a center of thinking. But as you turn the final page, something chills you, because the story doesn't stay bright forever. By the late 16th century, the peace that allowed Timbuktu to thrive begins to erode. In 1591, Moroccan forces armed with firearms invade and sack the city. Thousands are killed or enslaved. Scholars are arrested or exiled. Libraries are seized. Manuscripts are burned, stolen, or buried to protect them. It's the beginning of a long decline. Trade routes shift, empires fall, colonial powers rise, the desert creeps in. Sand fills the corners of once lively courtyards, and over the centuries, Timbuktu's reputation fades from center of learning. Too metaphor for remoteness. Too many Westerners, Timbuktu becomes a joke, a blank place, a nowhere. By the 1800s, European explorers arrive in search of treasure, gold, ivory, adventure. They are shocked to find books. They write about them with a mix of admiration and disbelief, describing dusty rooms full of crumbling paper, and Africans who dare to call themselves professors. Some manuscripts are bought, others stolen, some destroyed out of negligence or contempt, and still the books remain, because families hide them. For generations, they keep manuscripts in clay pots, underground cellars, inside crumbling trunks passed from parent to child. During colonial occupation, during civil wars, Even during the rise of extremist violence, manuscripts are smuggled out in donkey carts, hidden beneath sacks of rice. In the 21st century. During the 2012 occupation of Timbuktu by jihadist militants, families once again risked their lives to protect the libraries. Thousands of manuscripts are secretly transported out of the city, disguised as food or firewood. Why? Because to these families, the manuscripts are not relics, they are ancestors. Their ink is not just pigment, it is inheritance. And here's the quiet miracle: it worked today. Scholars estimate that over 350,000 Timbuktu manuscripts have survived, preserved by communities, restored by archivists, and now slowly being digitized by researchers around the world. The libraries are no longer visible. Many of the homes are damaged, but the knowledge is alive. You close the manuscript in your hands. It's rough, stained, and centuries old. But the words, they still speak, and you wonder if the world had truly understood what was buried in Timbuktu. Would it have let the sand cover it for so long? The room is dim, lit only by a single lamp. You are in a modern archive now, not in Mali, but in a quiet office in Johannesburg. Before you is a glass case. Inside it, resting on black velvet, is a manuscript from Timbuktu, dated somewhere between the 1500s and 1600s. The ink is still legible. The script is elegant, flowing. The pages are yellowed but intact. Along the margins, faint notations in a different hand, perhaps a student's corrections, or a scholar's reflections. It is a book not of conquest or kings, but of medicine. You lean closer. It discusses the treatment of fevers using local herbs, dietary adjustments, and prayer. There's a passage describing the relationship between emotional balance and physical illness. Another line warns against overindulgence in food during the dry season. This was not folk medicine. This was theory, practice, thought. And this, one manuscript, is just a grain in the desert. Across Mali, Senegal, Ghana, and parts of North Africa, collections of Timbuktu manuscripts are being recovered, catalogued, and digitized. The work is slow, fragile, and relentless. Archivists wear gloves. Pages are turned with brushes. Every page is scanned, labeled, preserved, not just for African history, but for global heritage. But the fight is not over. The preservation efforts still face threats, not only from extremists or weather, but from neglect. Funding is limited. The world's attention is fleeting, and the knowledge locked in these manuscripts remains largely untranslated, unread, untaught. Why? Because these texts exist in a space the modern world finds hard to categorize. They are not quite Islamic, not quite African, not quite medieval, not quite Western. They are too quiet to be viral, too complicated to summarize in a headline. And so they sit in hidden homes, in fragile vaults, in boxes labeled in Arabic, waiting for someone to listen. But if you stop, and you do, you begin to hear them. The manuscripts of Timbuktu speak of rainfall cycles and political ethics, of how to treat snake bites, how to mediate between neighbors, how to calculate inheritance under Islamic law in a matrilineal society. They are not just books, they are tools shaped by centuries of need, memory, and practice. And they remind us that Africa's intellectual history did not begin with colonization. It began with its own questions. That idea still makes some people uncomfortable, because if Africa preserved knowledge, copied it, critiqued it, built upon it, then the idea of Africa as a blank slate collapses. The myth that colonial powers brought civilization to the continent begins to rot in the face of these fragile pages. You leave the archives stepping into modern air, but something follows you. It's not just the thought of old books. It's the realization that history is not always written in victory. Sometimes it's copied in silence, protected by family, smuggled in sacks, buried in mud, and still, somehow it survives. And you think again of those families in Timbuktu, who, when faced with destruction, did not reach for weapons. They reached for manuscripts. They knew that the most valuable thing to carry through danger wasn't gold. It was memory, and so you wonder. One last time, if the world had paid more attention to the books of Timbuktu, would it have changed how we measure what a civilization truly is? Story 6. The Black Pharaohs of Egypt, not just a footnote to, are drifting up the Nile, but not toward Cairo, toward the source. The water narrows, the palm trees thin, the desert encroaches, and then, rising from the golden cliffs, come the ruins, statues, columns, temples, unmistakably Egyptian in style. And yet, you're not in Egypt anymore. You are in Nubia, ancient Kush, in what is now northern Sudan. And before you stands a chapter of history often reduced to a line in a textbook, or left out entirely. This is the land of the Black Pharaohs. They came from the south, from Kushite kingdoms like Napata and Meroe, not as invaders, but as heirs to an idea, heirs to a crumbling Egypt that had, by the 8th century BCE, fallen into internal division, foreign influence, and political instability. And from this power vacuum rose a dynasty the world would nearly forget, Egypt's 25th dynasty. They were not foreigners. They were not imitators. They were Africans, reclaiming African legacy. Let's step back. For centuries, the Egyptian Empire had ruled Nubia, building temples, extracting gold, importing soldiers and administrators into the region. But Nubia absorbed more than occupation. It absorbed culture. And long after Egypt's influence waned, Nubian kings continued to build in pharaonic style, write in hieroglyphs, and honor Egyptian gods. They made it their own. By the time Egypt fractured into petty rulers and competing factions, Nubia had grown strong, and then came King Pi, around 747 BCE. Pi, a Kushite king from Napata, launched a campaign northward, not a raid, a reunification. He called himself the true son of Ammon, the god once central to Egyptian power. Pi believed that Egypt had fallen into chaos, and that he, from the south, was destined to restore it. His inscriptions still exist, carved in stone. In them, Pi does not boast of destruction, but of purification. He conquered with religious legitimacy. City after city submitted. Priests welcomed him. Pharaohs fled. When Pi reached Memphis, he bathed offered sacrifices, and then issued orders to restore temples. He didn't sack the city, he blessed it, and with that, a Nubian dynasty ruled all of Egypt. The 25th dynasty, also called the Kushite dynasty, lasted nearly a century. Its rulers, including Shabaka, Taharqa, and Tanyataman, controlled an empire that stretched from central Sudan to the Mediterranean. They didn't erase Egyptian tradition, they revived it. They restored old temples, rebuilt neglected shrines, and reignited the worship of Amen. They were devout, scholarly, ambitious, and unmistakably black. Their features, carved into stone, show wide noses, full lips, braided hair, and royal regalia blending both Egyptian and Kushite styles. These were African rulers of Egypt, not anomalies, not pretenders, but legitimate pharaohs, and yet their story is rarely told. Even though their temples still stand, even though their tombs still rise, in pyramids no less. Yes, pyramids. More than 200 pyramids exist in Sudan today, more than in Egypt, built by the Nubian royals who continued the architectural legacy long after Egypt stopped. So why are they so often footnotes? Partly because the 25th dynasty was eventually overthrown not by rebellion, but by invasion. In 671 BCE, the Assyrians swept into Egypt with iron weapons and brutal efficiency. Taharqa, one of the greatest of the Nubian pharaohs, resisted fiercely, but was eventually driven south. His successors held on for a time, but the north was lost. Still, they did not vanish. They returned to Nubia, where the kingdom of Meru continued to flourish for centuries. They built new pyramids, developed their own script, traded iron, and ruled in splendor. But by the time European archaeologists arrived, centuries later, the narrative had shifted. To many early Egyptologists, mostly European men, the idea that black Africans had ruled Egypt seemed inconvenient, even offensive. They downplayed the 25th dynasty, described it as a foreign occupation, focused instead on Greece, Rome, and the classical world. In museums, Kushite statues were stored in basements, their faces chipped, their titles questioned, their stories excluded. But the stones didn't lie in tomb inscriptions, temple reliefs, and preserved papyri. The names remain Pie, Shabaka, Taharqa, Tanutamun, kings of Upper and Lower Egypt, pharaohs by right, black men who sat on the same throne as Ramses and Tutankhamun, and ruled with both power and piety. And so, as you stand before a statue of Taharqa in a British museum, his brow calm, his posture royal, you ask yourself, how can a man who once ruled half of Africa now stand without a nameplate? You are deep inside a sandstone temple now, not one in Luxor or Giza, but in Gebel Barkal, far to the south. The air smells of earth and age. The carvings on the walls are familiar. Gods with falcon heads, lotus motifs, rows of hieroglyphs. But here, something is different. The faces, these are Nubian faces. Full lips, coiled hair, tall, proud profiles carved with precision. This is not Egypt imposing itself upon Kush. This is Kush embracing, adapting, and reinterpreting Egyptian spirituality into its own royal language. This is what the 25th dynasty truly meant. Inheritance without imitation, back in Napata and later. Meru, the Nubian pharaohs built temples not as copies, but as continuations. They understood the architectural language of Egypt, but spoke it with a southern accent at Gebel Barkal. Taharqa built grand sanctuaries to Ammon, the god he believed, had sent him north to unify the Nile Valley. Inscriptions there describe him not as conqueror, but as restorer, chosen by the gods to bring balance between north and south, upper and lower, light and shadow. In many ways, Taharqa embodied the ideals of Egyptian kingship more than some of Egypt's own native rulers. Let's take a closer look at him. Taharqa, son of Pi, was a towering figure in both stature and reputation. Greek historians, like Herodotus, later mention him by name. He fought off repeated Assyrian invasions. He led building projects throughout Egypt and Nubia. He restored temples, regulated priesthoods, and promoted trade. His reign was one of resilience. When the Assyrians, equipped with iron weapons and brutal tactics, pushed into the Nile, Delta Taharqa didn't retreat. He regrouped, fought again, and though eventually forced to withdraw to Nubia, he never surrendered sovereignty over the southern Nile, even in exile. He ruled. After him came Tanyutaman, another Kushite pharaoh, who briefly retook parts of Egypt before retreating once more. These were not losses of legitimacy. They were military defeats against overwhelming odds. And still, in Kush, the line of kings endured. But here's where history fades again. As centuries passed, the kingdom of Meru, successor to Nap, continued building pyramids, writing in its own unique script called Meroitic, and practicing a hybrid spiritual culture that blended Egyptian forms with indigenous beliefs. And yet, it was ignored. Mero's pyramids are smaller, steeper than those of Giza, but more numerous. Over 200 still stand today, in various states of preservation, many looted, many When 19th century European explorers discovered them, they dug hastily, often destroying more than they preserved. Some didn't even believe they were real pyramids because they weren't Egyptian enough. But to the Kushites, these structures were gateways, tombs not just for kings, but for queens, nobles, generals. Inside, murals depicted royal women with crowns and scepters. Some scholars believe Kandake, Amanator, and other ruling queens held real political power, issuing decrees and leading armies. Black queens, black kings, pyramids, temples, a script still undeciphered, a culture still only partially understood. And yet, the textbooks still say, Sub-Saharan Africa had no writing systems, no empires, no high civilization. So you return to that image of Taharqa in the British Museum, of his likeness carved into a sandstone wall, of the statue in Khartoum, cracked by time but still upright. What is it that makes some civilizations remembered and others politely ignored? Perhaps it's not about achievement. Perhaps it's about narrative control. When Egypt was romanticized in the 19th century as a cradle of civilization, it was often divorced from its African context. The sands of Nubia were deemed too dark, too distant, too inconvenient. The presence of black rulers in the pharaonic line disrupted the myth of a Mediterranean Egypt. And so, the 25th dynasty was trimmed away. Some Egyptologists even referred to it as the Ethiopian interlude, as if it were a hiccup, a pause, not a reign. But stones do not lie, and the memory held in stone is patient. Today, scholars, especially African scholars, are reclaiming this narrative. Statues are being re-examined, tombs are being protected, museums are being pressured to return artifacts, and children in Sudan, in Mali, in Ghana, are slowly being told, you had pharaohs too, and maybe, one day, they'll believe it fully. But, for now, you whisper again, if we can name every European king from 1066, why do we still not teach the names Pi, Shabaka, and Taharqa in our schools? The Nile moves slowly here, glinting beneath a pale sky. You are standing beside a pyramid, not the smooth limestone giants of Giza, but a steep, elegant, dark stone pyramid, rising from the sands of Meru, sharp-edged, compact, and weathered by centuries. It marks the burial site of a Kushite king, perhaps Taharqa, perhaps one of the queens who came after him. You run your hand over the carved hieroglyphs, and for a moment, it feels like the stones are breathing. But there are no tourists, no floodlights, no tour buses. This is a quiet place, and like so much of African history, it remains visible and yet unseen. Here in this final chapter, we consider the legacy. The 25th dynasty lasted less than a century, but its impact far outlived its rule. When the Kushite pharaohs returned to Nubia after being pushed out of northern Egypt, they did not collapse. They evolved. They developed new art styles. They ruled for centuries more. They forged a hybrid identity, not Egyptian, not sub-Saharan, but uniquely Kushite. Their pyramids dotted the landscape. Their own script, Meroitic, still remains undeciphered, a mystery that could unlock volumes about how these rulers thought, wrote, and governed. Imagine an African writing system from over 2,000 years ago, still waiting to be understood, and yet the wider world remained disinterested. In schoolbooks, the story of ancient Egypt is often flattened. It ends with Cleopatra, or it skips from Ramses to Rome. Rarely do we hear that one of the most religiously devout and restoration dynasties came not from the Mediterranean, but from deep in Africa. Even when mentioned, the 25th dynasty is described in muted terms. Nubian. Interlude: foreign rulers. No native dynasty. As though bloodlines matter more than buildings. As though temples were built chaos. Calmed, borders defended. Gods honored are not enough to grant legitimacy. As though skin color disqualifies kingship, but the archaeological record is clear. The temple walls are inscribed. The pyramids still stand. The stones do not care what we believe. They simply tell us, this happened. There were black pharaohs. They ruled wisely. They worshipped Amun. They unified Egypt. They left behind art, architecture, law, and ceremony. And then, over time, they were buried in stone and in silence. But now, the silence is being broken in Sudan. Schoolchildren visit the pyramids of Meru and learn that their ancestors were kings, not just servants or slaves in someone else's story. In universities across Africa and the diaspora, historians and archaeologists are reclaiming these narratives, not as myth correction, but as history restoration. Even in global pop culture, references to the Black Pharaohs are beginning to emerge in novels, documentaries, films. Not always accurate, but a start. A signal that the world is ready to remember what it once chose to forget. And perhaps, more importantly, it's a reminder that civilization is not owned by any one race, region, or religion. Greatness, whether measured in stone or story, can rise from anywhere. And in the golden cliffs of Nubia, it did. The kings who came from the south did not just wear crowns. They carried with them an idea that power could move upstream, that legacy could be reclaimed, that Egypt's grandeur could be reborn from African soil. And though the world tried to footnote them out of history, the Nile remembers, so do the stars that watched over them, and now so do you. And as you step away from the pyramid, wind swirling around your ankles, you ask the question that has lingered through centuries. If these men and women wore the crown with wisdom, built with care, and ruled with justice, what makes them any less pharaoh than the ones carved into classroom walls?